The request came through encrypted diplomatic channels in late January 2025, just weeks after Trump's second inauguration created uncertainty about American security commitments in Africa. France, watching Russian influence expand in the Sahel and Chinese infrastructure projects proliferate across the continent, was recalculating its Africa strategy. The Macron administration had spent 2 years attempting to salvage France's position after being militarily expelled from Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. The latest approach was pragmatic rather than imperial. France would acknowledge past mistakes, offer genuine partnership on African terms, and rebuild relationships based on mutual interest rather than historical obligation. The specific request was tactical but symbolically significant. France wanted permission to conduct a limited counterterrorism operation in northern Burkina Faso targeting a high-value terrorist commander whose network threatened both Burkinabè civilians and French interests in neighboring countries. The operation would involve French special forces, air support, and intelligence assets. It would be conducted in coordination with Burkinabè forces and under nominal Burkinabè command. France would provide all operational costs, share all intelligence gathered, and withdraw immediately upon mission completion. Most importantly, the request emphasized this would be a one-time operation, not the beginning of renewed French military presence. The French calculated that Traoré might accept because the operation served clear Burkinabè security interests, required no long-term French presence, and would demonstrate that post-imperial France could cooperate with African nations on genuinely mutual terms rather than demanding subordination. The request reached Traoré's office on a Thursday evening. His national security team had been briefed by French military attaches earlier that day about the intelligence on the terrorist commander and the proposed operational plan. The French presentation was professional, detailed intelligence, clear operational objectives, explicit timeline, comprehensive risk assessment, and formal request for Burkinabè approval and coordination. It was everything France's historical approach had not been. Respectful of sovereignty, transparent about intentions, genuinely collaborative. Traoré convened his Security Council that evening to review the request. The discussion revealed competing perspectives. His defense minister saw tactical value, the target is legitimate. The French have capabilities we currently lack for this kind of precision operation. If they're willing to conduct the operation under our command and at their expense, it achieves our security objective without depleting our resources. Refusing competent assistance for ideological reasons when our people's security is at stake would be irresponsible. His intelligence chief was more skeptical. The operation itself may be legitimate. But accepting it creates precedent that France can conduct military operations in Burkina Faso with our permission. Today it's one limited operation. Tomorrow it's regular requests for limited operations that gradually rebuild French military presence. We spent 2 years expelling French forces. Inviting them back, even for one operation, sends the wrong message domestically and internationally. The foreign minister focused on diplomatic implications. France is testing whether post-expulsion relationship can include selective military cooperation. How we respond shapes not just Franco-Burkinabè relations but how other African nations approach similar requests. If we accept, we validate that ejecting French forces doesn't mean permanent separation, it means renegotiating terms. If we refuse, we signal that French military presence in any form is unacceptable regardless of operational merit. Traoré listened carefully to each perspective, then asked the critical question. If we approve this operation and it succeeds, what prevents France from requesting another operation next month? And another after that? Because limited one-time operation can easily become series of limited operations which functionally rebuilds French military presence through incremental requests rather than formal basing agreements. The defense minister's argument that we should accept competent assistance is valid. But it assumes France won't leverage one operation into normalized military presence. Does anyone believe France is offering one operation with no expectation of future access? The room was quiet. Everyone understood that France's request, however genuinely framed as one-time tactical cooperation, was also a strategic test of whether military cooperation was possible and potentially a foundation for rebuilding French security presence. Traoré made his decision quickly: we decline the request. Not because the operation lacks merit or because we're ideologically opposed to all French cooperation. We decline because accepting creates precedent and expectation that French military operations in Burkina Faso are negotiable. They're not. We expelled French forces because French military presence came with political expectations, operational control, and strategic subordination that contradicted our sovereignty. Accepting one limited operation opens the door to incremental restoration of exactly what we expelled. If the terrorist target is priority, we conduct the operation with our own forces or with partners who aren't trying to rebuild military presence in our territory. The decision was communicated to French officials that same evening, less than 6 hours after the request was received. The response was diplomatically courteous but substantively final. Burkina Faso appreciates France's intelligence sharing regarding the terrorist threat and France's offer of operational assistance. However, Burkina Faso will address this security challenge using our own capabilities and existing security partnerships. We decline the request for French military operations in Burkinabè territory. This decision is final and reflects our consistent position that Burkina Faso's security is managed by Burkinabè forces and our chosen partners, which currently do not include French military presence in any form. The speed of the rejection surprised French officials. They'd expected deliberation, negotiation about operational parameters, perhaps conditions Traoré would impose. Instead, outright refusal within hours, framed not as maybe later but as definitive policy that French military operations were categorically unacceptable. The French response attempted to preserve dialogue: we respect Burkina Faso's decision regarding operational sovereignty. However, we'd like to understand whether the concerns are about this specific operation or about French military cooperation generally. If there are modifications to the operational proposal that would address sovereignty concerns, we're willing to restructure. Our goal is demonstrating that France can cooperate with African partners on terms they define, not terms we impose. Traoré's reply was equally clear: the concern isn't about operational parameters. It's about precedent. Any French military operation in Burkina Faso, regardless of how carefully structured to respect our sovereignty, creates expectation of future operations and foundation for normalizing French military presence. That's unacceptable. Burkina Faso expelled French forces after determining that French military presence was incompatible with our sovereignty. That determination hasn't changed. We're not negotiating terms for French military operations because we're not accepting French military operations under any terms. The exchange clarified that this wasn't a negotiation France could win by offering better terms. Traoré had made a categorical decision that French military presence, even in limited tactical form, was incompatible with Burkina Faso's post-expulsion sovereignty framework. Within 48 hours, the story leaked to media. French sources likely hoping public pressure would create opening for reconsideration. Le Monde reported, France proposes joint counterterrorism operation in Burkina Faso, Traoré refuses within hours. The article framed it as French attempt at partnership being rebuffed by ideological anti-French stance. African media framed it differently: Traoré rejects French military return, maintains sovereignty position. The narrative battle revealed competing interpretations. France claiming to offer genuine cooperation, Traoré seeing attempted incremental restoration of military presence. 3 days after the rejection, Macron gave an interview addressing Franco-African relations generally without naming Burkina Faso specifically. His comments revealed French frustration: France has acknowledged past mistakes in Africa. We've committed to genuine partnership based on mutual respect and African agency. But partnership requires both sides being willing to cooperate when cooperation serves mutual interests. When African nations refuse all cooperation with France regardless of merit, citing historical grievances as justification for categorical rejection. That's not sovereignty, that's letting the past prevent pragmatic present cooperation. France will continue offering partnership to African nations ready for it. Those that aren't ready will find France has other partners in Africa who recognize mutual benefit when it's genuinely offered. The message was clear: France was losing patience with nations like Burkina Faso that rejected French engagement categorically. Traoré's response came via Twitter, direct and unapologetic. France frames categorical rejection of French military operations as letting the past prevent pragmatic cooperation. But the issue isn't past grievances. It's present assessment that accepting one French military operation creates precedent for ongoing French military presence through incremental requests. That's not historical grudge, that's strategic calculation. If France genuinely wants partnership, offer cooperation that doesn't require French military operations in our territory. Economic cooperation, diplomatic engagement, technical assistance, all possible. But French soldiers conducting operations in Burkina Faso, even limited ones, is non-negotiable. That's not rejecting partnership. That's defining its boundaries. The Twitter exchange went viral, crystallizing the fundamental disagreement. France believed genuine partnership required African nations accepting beneficial cooperation regardless of source. Traoré believed genuine partnership required respecting when African nations determined certain forms of cooperation, specifically military presence, were categorically unacceptable regardless of tactical merit. 1 week after the rejection, Burkina Faso announced it would conduct an operation targeting the same terrorist commander using Burkinabè forces with Russian advisory support. The operation was successful, the commander was killed, his network disrupted. The success was tactically significant but symbolically more important. Burkina Faso had proven it could achieve the security objective without accepting French military operations. African media coverage emphasized the demonstration of capability. Burkina Faso achieves objective France offered to accomplish, using own forces. French media was more critical. Burkina Faso accepts Russian military support while refusing French partnership. The successful Burkinabè operation created an uncomfortable reality for French strategic planners. Their offer of military assistance had been not just rejected but rendered unnecessary by Burkina Faso's demonstration of independent capability. 2 weeks after the operation, a senior French diplomat requested an off-the-record meeting with Traoré during an African Union summit. The conversation was remarkably frank. "Captain Traoré, I need to understand France's position going forward with Burkina Faso. President Macron genuinely believed the counterterrorism proposal represented new approach, respecting your sovereignty, serving your interests, demonstrating France can cooperate without dominating. Your rejection within hours, followed by conducting the operation with Russian support, sends clear message that no French military cooperation is acceptable under any circumstances. Is that accurate?" Traoré appreciated the directness. "Yes, that's accurate. Not because we're ideologically opposed to France or unable to acknowledge when French capabilities might be tactically useful, but because accepting any French military operation creates precedent that French military presence in Burkina Faso is negotiable. It's not. We expelled French forces after determining that French military presence, regardless of how it's structured or justified, comes with political expectations and strategic implications incompatible with our sovereignty. That determination is final. So there's no form of French military cooperation you'd accept? Even if structured entirely on your terms?" Correct. Because the issue isn't terms, it's precedent. One operation conducted entirely on our terms still establishes that French military operations in Burkina Faso are possible. That creates foundation for future requests. We cooperated successfully before, why not again? And incremental requests rebuild presence we spent 2 years dismantling. Better to categorically refuse any French military operations than to negotiate terms that create slippery slope back to French military presence. The French diplomat was quiet for a moment, then asked the question Paris needed answered: is this position specific to Burkina Faso under your leadership, or do you think it represents broader African trend? Traoré's response was carefully considered: I can't speak for other African nations. But I can tell you that multiple African leaders have privately expressed that they appreciate Burkina Faso maintaining firm boundaries with France because it creates political space for them to be more assertive in their own negotiations. When one African nation categorically refuses French military operations, it becomes harder for France to pressure other nations by claiming such refusal is unprecedented or unreasonable. So while each nation makes its own decisions, Burkina Faso's position influences what's politically possible elsewhere. It was an acknowledgement that Traoré's rejection had strategic impact beyond bilateral Franco-Burkinabè relations. It was shifting what African nations generally felt empowered to refuse. 3 months after the initial rejection, France made one more attempt through different framing. Rather than requesting permission for French operations, France offered to provide intelligence, equipment, and training to Burkinabè forces for operations Burkina Faso would conduct independently. No French soldiers in Burkina Faso, no French operational control, just French support for Burkinabè operations. The proposal was presented as addressing Traoré's sovereignty concerns while still allowing beneficial cooperation. Traoré's national security team reviewed the proposal more carefully this time since it didn't involve French military presence. The assessment was mixed. The intelligence sharing would be valuable. The equipment offered included items Burkina Faso needed. The training could enhance capabilities. But the proposal still created dependency. Burkinabè operations would rely on French intelligence, French equipment, French training. That dependency would give France leverage over Burkinabè security decisions even without French soldiers present. Traoré's decision was again negative, but this time he provided detailed explanation. France's revised proposal removes French soldiers from Burkinabè territory, which addresses one sovereignty concern. But it creates different problem. Dependency on French intelligence, equipment, and training for our operations. That dependency becomes leverage. If France disapproves of our political decisions or partnerships, they can withdraw support, degrading our operational capability. We've worked hard to diversify security partnerships specifically to avoid any single partner having that leverage. Accepting French intelligence equipment training package would recreate French leverage through dependency rather than presence. We declined for the same fundamental reason we declined the original request. Maintaining sovereignty requires avoiding French leverage over our security sector, whether that leverage comes from French soldiers in our territory or from dependency on French support for our operations. The explanation was shared with French officials and leaked to media, generating significant discussion among African security analysts. The argument that sovereignty required avoiding not just foreign military presence but also dependency on foreign security support resonated across Africa, where many nations relied heavily on Western intelligence, equipment, and training. One Pan-African security scholar published analysis: Captain Traoré's rejection of French support proposal articulates sophisticated understanding of sovereignty. Traditional sovereignty discourse focuses on territorial control. Preventing foreign military presence. Traoré extends this to functional sovereignty, preventing dependency that creates leverage. His argument is that accepting French intelligence equipment training for Burkinabè operations would give France ability to degrade Burkinabè security capability by withdrawing support, making Burkina Faso functionally dependent despite maintaining territorial sovereignty. This represents evolved African sovereignty thinking. It's not enough to keep foreign soldiers out, must also avoid dependencies that give foreign powers leverage over security decisions. 6 months after the initial rejection, at a security conference in Dakar, a French general gave a presentation on the future of Franco-African security cooperation that implicitly addressed the Burkina Faso situation without naming Traoré. The thrust was that France had genuinely reformed its approach, was offering cooperation on African terms, but some African nations were so focused on past grievances they couldn't recognize genuine partnership when offered. During Q&A, a West African journalist asked pointed question, "General, you say France offers cooperation on African terms. But when Burkina Faso defined their terms as no French military operations under any circumstances, France characterized this as unreasonable rejection driven by ideology rather than pragmatism. Isn't that France still expecting African nations to accept French definition of reasonable cooperation rather than genuinely accepting African terms?" The general's response was careful. There's difference between respecting African sovereignty and accepting that beneficial cooperation should be refused for symbolic reasons. France offered Burkina Faso operationally valuable cooperation structured to respect their sovereignty. The refusal wasn't based on operational concerns, it was based on political determination that any French military cooperation is unacceptable. That's African prerogative, but let's be clear, it's ideological choice, not sovereignty necessity. Traoré was present at the conference. He raised his hand. "General, you just characterized Burkina Faso's refusal of French military cooperation as ideological choice rather than sovereignty necessity. Let me explain why it's precisely sovereignty necessity. Sovereignty isn't just territorial control, it's decision-making independence. Accepting French military operations, even limited ones structured respectfully, creates precedent that French military presence in Burkina Faso is negotiable based on operational merit. That precedent becomes leverage in future discussions. We cooperated before, circumstances now require cooperation again. Incremental operations rebuild presence we dismantled. Refusing any French military operations isn't ideological, it's strategic prevention of leverage accumulation. That's not ideology. That's sovereignty protection." The exchange captured the fundamental disagreement. France believed sovereignty meant African nations making decisions about cooperation based on merit. Traoré believed sovereignty meant African nations having right to categorically refuse certain forms of cooperation, specifically former colonial powers' military presence, regardless of merit, based on assessment that such cooperation created unacceptable precedent and leverage. Neither side was wrong in their reasoning, they were operating from incompatible frameworks about what sovereignty required. 1 year after the initial rejection, French Africa policy had shifted notably. France no longer approached nations like Burkina Faso with military cooperation proposals. Instead, France focused on African nations where military cooperation remained politically acceptable. Countries that hadn't expelled French forces or had subsequently invited them back under renegotiated terms. The shift was pragmatic. France had limited resources and political capital for Africa engagement. Investing those resources in nations categorically opposed to French military presence was inefficient compared to deepening partnerships with nations open to cooperation. For Traoré, this outcome validated his approach. By categorically refusing French military cooperation and demonstrating Burkina Faso could achieve security objectives independently, he'd established that Burkina Faso's security policy was genuinely sovereign, not dependent on French approval, not vulnerable to French pressure, not negotiable based on French offers of assistance. 18 months after the rejection, when asked about the decision and its aftermath, Traoré's assessment was characteristically direct. France requested permission for military operation in Burkina Faso. We refused within hours. Not because the operation lacked tactical merit. Not because we're ideologically opposed to all French cooperation. We refused because accepting one French military operation creates precedent for ongoing French military presence through incremental requests. We expelled French forces after determining French military presence was incompatible with our sovereignty. Inviting them back for limited operation would undermine that determination. France characterized our refusal as ideological rejection of beneficial cooperation. We characterized it as strategic sovereignty protection. The difference is that France believes sovereignty means making decisions about cooperation based on operational merit. We believe sovereignty means having right to categorically refuse certain cooperation, specifically former colonial powers' military operations. Based on assessment that such cooperation creates unacceptable precedent regardless of merit. 1 year later, France focuses military cooperation on African nations open to it. We focus security on partnerships we've chosen. That's not ideology. That's sovereignty functioning as it should, nations making strategic choices based on their assessment of their interests, not based on what former colonial powers offer or expect.